This is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, escalation risk after 2 straight days of tit-for-tat strikes. A tense pause between the U.S. and Iran, but no clear sign the threat has passed. Fears of a broader conflict still lingering, with President Trump warning Tehran any new attack will be met with even greater force. Wendy Sherman, the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, will join us with her reaction. And crude awakening. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz brought to a near standstill, but energy markets take it largely in stride today, betting the strikes will remain limited in scope. We'll discuss the fallout for energy markets with Mike Sommers of the American Petroleum Institute later this hour. And Democrats' main problem. Graham Platner says he'll exit Maine Senate race, scrambling the Democratic fight to unseat Senator Susan Collins. Now the state party is racing to fill the spot as a new wave of hopefuls are already jumping in, with just over 2 weeks until a replacement must be named. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lines has the night off. We begin this evening at the White House, where there are growing questions about the ceasefire with Iran that appears to be on life support at best. President Trump at one point declaring it over, at the same time shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz grinding to a near halt, a dramatic shift that could have major implications in the U.S. and abroad. Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason joins us now from a rainy North Lawn. Jeff, we've not heard from the president today. Do we assume the ceasefire is in fact off?
I mean, I think life support was a good way of describing it, Joe. Certainly what we're seeing now in terms of military activity, both from the Iranians and from the United States, are not consistent with what a ceasefire is. I mean, they are attacking each other, which of course is not what happens when the two sides agree not to attack each other. So fear of escalation, risk of escalation, absolutely something that is reverberating through the halls of Washington, here at the White House, and no doubt the Capitol, and also throughout the Middle East right now.
There's more than this to talk about, Jeff. As we understand, they did target 90 specific targets last evening. The president is also looking at the deadline to sign a bipartisan housing bill. It's just about to resolve here, become law on Friday at midnight. If he chooses to do nothing, Jeff Mason, is that the plan? Or does he possibly sign this or even veto it?
That's a different kind of war, Joe Matthew. Yeah, that's a big question. And I think the answer, based at least on how we've seen him behave and react to the housing bill in the last several days, is that he will likely not sign it, but it will go into law because he's not going to veto it. Now, anything can change in the next 24 to 36 hours, but that seems to be likely the case. He doesn't want to bring a lot of attention to it, doesn't want to give it fanfare. I asked him in the Oval Office a little over a week ago what he was going to do about the housing bill, and he just said, for me, it's a big yawn. He's much more interested in the Save America Act, which would reduce or tamp down on mail-in voting. And he doesn't have the votes for that, and he doesn't want to draw attention to this, even though both Republicans and Democrats see it as a bipartisan win.
Right. I guess it could be a true Friday night news dump. Jeff, lastly, is there a new reno project happening behind you there at the White House? First, we saw scaffolding in front of the north portico. Today, they wrapped it with what looks like some sort of tapestry with a photograph on it, making it look like the portico that's not under construction. What are they doing behind that tapestry?
I'm glad you mentioned that it looks like a photograph, because it actually totally fooled me today when I was walking in. If you look behind me, there is like a big tarp up, which has a picture essentially of what the White House behind it looks like. And it fooled me, but the White House has said behind that, oh, there's some lightning and thunder. Behind that, they are working on upgrading the columns. And that is just one more thing that the president is doing to improve the White House. And it's another example of some of his pet projects here in D.C.
Always a trooper. Jeff, let's not end up on the Daily Show this evening. Can we get this man an umbrella, get him back in the West Wing? Thank you, Jeff, as always.
Sounds like a plan.
Bloomberg White House correspondent, our intrepid, well, I guess he could be our weather reporter as well. Some severe weather blowing through the nation's capital this evening. Jeff, thank you for braving Mother Nature. Joining us now for more is Wendy Sherman, as we promised, the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, now a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. She was the lead U.S. negotiator for the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And Wendy, it's always a pleasure to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm glad that you're somewhere safe and in shelter. With regard to what I just mentioned and your experience in 2015, with all the talk of the JCPOA being replaced over the past couple of months, with your understanding of the style in which Iran negotiates, is diplomacy still possible at this time, or are we back to war?
I think diplomacy is quite challenged right now. It's always good to be with you, Joe, and I agree with what Jeff said about the ceasefire, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist anymore. The memorandum of understanding was weak to begin with, filled with words that could be interpreted many ways. And there's no doubt that Iran wants to control the Strait of Hormuz, and they've made a calculation here that they can get their oil through and use the strait to deter the U.S. It's quite difficult to do both at the same time, but they think money and time is on their side, and that the United States won't be able to deal with rising escalation. I'd add a couple of other things. If the president really wants to save America, it's not the Save America Act. It's really ending this war and getting down to serious diplomacy. I don't think, with all due respect, that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have had the expertise around them to really deal with the Iranians. These are not an easy bunch. They're very tough. They are the largest state sponsor of terrorism. This is not a great regime. It's even more hardline than the previous one that was part of a funeral the past few days. So the president is really in a place of great difficulty. I understand he has spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu this afternoon, who's probably chomping at the bit to be able to get back into war, because that's in his interest, even if it's not in ours.
Wendy, as you were speaking, CENTCOM just posted a statement on Twitter. It says, claim, circled with a line through it, Iranian state media claims that transit through the Strait of Hormuz is only permitted through routes designated by Iran. Truth. Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz, and goes on to explain what has happened since May. You know the old line, if you're explaining, you're losing. What world are we in where CENTCOM has to issue a statement like that? Is that not already apparent?
Quite extraordinary, Joe, for them to issue such a statement. What happened here is that the president really didn't have a strategy to begin with. It was easy to tear up the 2015 agreement. That's an easy thing to do. He thought he could do negotiations to get to, quote, a better deal. But those negotiations were never as serious or as complex as they needed to be. And every time Witkoff and Kushner began to negotiate, we decided after 2 or 3 rounds to bomb Iran instead. And it's not that we haven't done harm to the regime. We have. We have buried some of their 60% enriched uranium underground, but you can't bomb away knowledge. They know what to do. We haven't gotten to what the president constantly says he wants to do, which is to make sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And no amount of war by the United States and Israel is going to accomplish that. And I would add 2 other things. It's costing the United States a fortune. A fortune. We have $1 trillion defense budget, and the Department of War is now saying they don't have enough money. And every time this goes on, it costs more money. And it costs American taxpayers, obviously, in the price of groceries, in the price of their gasoline every day. And I'm glad that the markets have sort of absorbed that for now. But you know better than I that we are really at a tough point in terms of safety of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and what we have really to play with here as we get into more and more trouble. If in fact we now have said Iran can't move its oil, looks like we're going to put the blockade back up. The U.S. is going to try to control the strait. Iran is going to try to obfuscate in every way it possibly can. The President of the United States is stuck. I hope he is in the Situation Room looking at what are a bunch of very bad alternatives for the United States.
Wow. We're going to speak later on this hour, speaking of the status of our strategic reserves, with Mike Sommers from the American Petroleum Institute. Wendy, I want to speak to you as the diplomat for a moment, because you've questioned some of the people who are at the table, whether direct or indirect talks that we've seen so far in Witkoff and Kushner, President Trump's own posture here. The art of the deal versus the science or the art of diplomacy, Wendy. It was in 2011. You know, there's a tweet for everything. July 27th, 2011. President Trump posted on Twitter, "Know when to walk away from the table, the art of the deal." And that is apparently what he's doing. Does Iran call his bluff? Do they believe him?
Well, I think they know that the president is volatile. We heard that on June 16th, I think it was. He was saying that Iran was a great group of new guys that they were dealing with, and now he's saying they're scum. Tomorrow, if he's worried about our markets, he may be saying, and he did last night, they really want a deal. I'm not sure he's talked to them or there been any communication. He's just trying to raise optimism that this is short-term, what we're going through. There is nothing short-term about this. Kim Gaddis of the Financial Times said this is like throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. There hasn't been a strategy here from the beginning. You cannot do this with just two people. And I think the president thinks virtually everything can be solved with money, with business investment, with building. We've seen what he's done to the White House. He really likes to build and construct and look at concrete things, granite, of course, and business investment as the answer to all things. He doesn't understand Iran. Iran is a culture of resistance. It is an Islamic republic. It believes deeply. We just saw millions of people turn out to the funeral of a supreme leader who was very repressive to his own people. But there was still some regard for him. In many ways, they've become more nationalized because of the attacks against them. So it's not that Witkoff and Kushner aren't smart. They're smart, but they cannot do this alone, and they have to understand the country and have the expertise around them to get this done. I didn't do this by myself.
We saw those images from the funeral, Wendy, the chants of death to America. But how do you negotiate with an Ayatollah whose father, whose wife and son you killed?
Pretty tough, very tough. This is harder than what we had to do because of the bombing that's gone on, because of the assassinations that have gone on. But Iran does need money, and it does need to be able to sell its oil, and it does want to get hold of its frozen assets. Those sanctions bring them to a negotiating table, but they don't solve the problem. You have to see what their interests are, make sure you know what our goals, what our objectives, what our primary interests are. Yes, we believe in freedom of navigation. We want to get the strait opened, but the president has also said he wants to make sure they cannot get to a nuclear weapon. I want to make sure they can't get to a nuclear weapon. You have to decide what your first and foremost objective is. Right now, we're nowhere, and I don't see a strategy going forward.
I'd love to hear from you about Ukraine while you're with us, Wendy, because the president was spinning a couple of plates at the NATO summit this week. As the Iran war loomed over the conference, there was some pretty good news when it came to Ukraine, at least if you're President Zelensky, in getting this license to start creating or manufacturing Patriot missiles inside Ukraine. Realizing this could take a minute. In fact, it could take a few months from what experts are saying right now. Is this the turning point that Ukraine was hoping for?
Well, this is a very important thing because having Patriot defense would be absolutely fundamental to them being able to sustain what they need to do to win this war. It will take time for them to do this. Germany and Japan are the only other countries that have this license. So, yes, that was a very positive thing. The president ostensibly also said that Europe could continue to buy weapons from us and then give them to the Ukrainians. Our stockpiles are not all that we want them to be because of what's happening in the Middle East, of course, and because of the DOD or Department of War budget. So there are some obstacles here. I hope the president appreciated the resilience of Ukraine, their ability to get to strategic targets inside of Russia, to make the Russian people understand that the war is coming home to them economically and in terms of the people they're losing. But Vladimir Putin still has not had sanctions imposed upon him with enough pressure from the United States, nor have we helped Ukraine enough in the moment to get the kind of pressure necessary to get Putin to the table. He believes Ukraine belongs to him. He's not giving up easily. He really doesn't seem to care what it costs the people in his country or what it costs the economy of his country. He's going on, and every time the president says, I think he wants a deal, I don't see any evidence of that. We've got to help Ukraine, keep putting more pressure on Russia. But yes, this license is very positive news.
Wendy, it's good to see you. We always appreciate sharing some thoughts with Wendy Sherman, live with us on Bloomberg. Thank you. Oil prices pulled back modestly from yesterday's surge, even as traffic slowed to a near halt in the Strait. Stock indexes moved higher as some of the hardest hit chip names bounced back today, beginning with memory stocks. We turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, live at World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Nora.
Hey, well, a lot of green across our screen today as we look at where major indexes ended. We did see investors really looking past the conflict that we've been seeing ongoing in the Middle East, this back and forth as to whether or not we're going to get to some sort of peace accord that holds between the U.S. and Iran. But we did see investors looking towards some of those risky assets, looking at the tech sector, memory chips getting a bid. If you take a look at the SOX index, I did see that one also rallying up about 3% on the day. So as you'd imagine, as you look at the major indexes, the NASDAQ was the outperformer, up about 1.6% on the day. The S&P 500 rising by about 0.8%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by just about 0.3%. When you look at some of those chip makers in the tech space more broadly, you saw Broadcom and Micron, some of the biggest point gainers in the S&P 500 right after Meta. We did see oil lower as we're seeing investors really pricing in what the implications could be long term when we think about just access and what's available when we think about the Strait of Hormuz and whether or not we're going to see continued disruptions there. Well, we did see oil actually pulling back, currently hanging around $76 a barrel. And we did see some news out post-market that coming from Netflix. So we did see that executives were reporting at the Wall Street Journal, reporting that they were recently discussing adding live channels. If you take a look at some of the stock action in Netflix right now in the post-market trade, it's lower by almost nearly 2%. So you are seeing investors really digesting what that could mean for the company, especially as we think about streaming services and whether or not they're actually able to bundle live channels. So this is some interesting developments that we're getting out of Netflix. But what investors will be looking toward tomorrow is an IPO. We are seeing SK Hynix potentially, we'll be getting priced right now, a U.S. listing at $149 a share. Now, this offering was really important because it was more than 7 times oversubscribed. So it really just tells you what investors are thinking about in the tech space and the fact that we're still seeing the door open as it comes to IPOs here in the United States.
Yeah, Hynix is going to be a big moment tomorrow, and we'll be tracking Netflix as well. Interesting. We all rushed to cut the cord, Nora. Now, apparently, we're putting the cord back into place. Nora Melinda, live in New York. We thank you. Quick reminder, by the way, Bloomberg tech anchor Ed Ludlow will be at the NASDAQ tomorrow morning for that U.S. trading debut of SK Hynix. In fact, he's going to be speaking with SK Chair Che Taiwan, 10:30 a.m. Eastern. You're not going to want to miss that. It's going to be one of the big movers, for better or worse, tomorrow on Wall Street, and a big story for us here at Bloomberg. Coming up, Graham Platner is out, the Democratic Senate candidate, suspending his campaign after allegations of sexual assault. Now Democrats in Maine try to pick up the pieces. We'll discuss next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee has the night off. Graham Platner out with a video last evening, came around 8 p.m., 11 minutes long, freestyle. shot with the phone, announcing he is suspending his campaign for U.S. Senate following, of course, a sexual assault allegation heard round the country, made public earlier this week. Platner has denied the allegations, continues to do so now, but local and national Democrats called for him to step aside following Monday's report, with the party now preparing for a nominating convention to find their next nominee ahead of the July 27th deadline. Joining us now, a man who knows this area of the country and politics well, Matt Robison, former Democratic campaign manager and legislative director, has worked with members of Maine's congressional delegation, in fact, throughout New England. And Matt, it's great to have you back. What's your thought on the next steps here? Obviously, Graham Platner still needs to file the paperwork, presuming that he does. How do you assemble 600 delegates and have a credible convention in less than 3 weeks?
Is really tough. I don't envy the challenge that's ahead of the Maine Democratic Party or national Democrats who have to quietly try to maneuver to get this right. You know, it's a misnomer that the Chinese use the same word for crisis and opportunity. It's not really true, but it does sort of apply here. The fact of the matter is that Graham Platner was quietly one of the most underperforming candidates that Democrats have put forward in any competitive terrain in this cycle. And in the last few weeks, in polling averages, his advantage has slipped by about 4 or 5 points, to the point where the Maine Senate race was essentially tied even before this latest round of allegations. So Democrats are quietly, maybe not so quietly, breathing a major sigh of relief that they get to etch-a-sketch this race and start fresh. Now, that's not going to be easy to do because national Democrats desperately want to get this right, but they know they can't be seen putting a thumb on the scale here. That's like the kiss of death in Democratic Party politics these days. You see that in all the announcements from all the people who want to be nominated. They're playing up their outsider credentials, their grassroots, energy and momentum. They say that they can capture the same kind of vibe that Graham Platner was capturing, which is very real on the ground in Maine. Right. So the national Democrats, they want to direct the show here. They want to try to influence things, but they can't be seen doing it.
Well, we've got an Axios report out, Matt, this evening. Platner says he's not going to file his withdrawal papers until Monday. That's the day that's the deadline for him to get out of the race and allow for another candidate. Look, he's continuing to profess his innocence. He has not apologized, actually. In fact, some were disappointed that he did not in the video. Is there any chance that he tries to revive this, stay in the race?
I can't speak for the mindset of someone like this. It would be, this is the kind of time where if you have people in your life that you trust in politics, they come to you and they give it to you straight. There's no path forward for him. He is not going to come out of this with any kind of a good reputation. But, if he tries to hang on here, he would be such an all-time villain in American politics and Maine politics. It's not even worth talking about. I think this is much more of a power play. He's already made noises that he wants to have a role in appointing, like having an influence in who's going to succeed him here. That's why the early money in prediction markets is on a figure like Troy Jackson, the former Maine State Senate president, who is a strong Bernie Sanders supporter, has a somewhat similar echo of political profile as Graham Platner, was an ally of Platner's. Now, of course, from Democrats' standpoint, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword there, because what Republicans are definitely going to do is tar whoever the nominee is with association with Platner. So that's a little bit of a vulnerability, but that's why you see a 50% likelihood in prediction markets right now that Troy Jackson is going to emerge. Another possibility is someone like the Maine Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows, who also has very solid progressive credentials and might satisfy Platner and ease his way out of the race.
It's going to be tough for them to take the Senate without Maine, Matt. Let's stay in touch on this. Matt Robison, we thank you. Coming up, how the oil industry is viewing the escalation with Iran. Mike Sommers from the American Petroleum Institute with us next, and only on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We hit them 20 to 1. Every time they hit us, we're going to hit them 20. They did a little something today, but it was really retribution for last night. They hit actually 3 boats, not 2. And when they hit, we hit back much harder.
President Trump's message on Air Force One on the way home late yesterday was clear. If Iran hits back, the U.S. will hit harder. 20 to 1, he says. That warning coming amid 2 rounds of strikes on Iran this week. sharp turn after a brief diplomatic opening that had helped to calm the oil markets. In fact, crude oil prices were back to where they were before the war began. Now we're back above pre-war levels, raising the risk that voters feel the fallout at the gas pump. And for Republicans, it creates President Trump's latest self-made headache, defending the president while managing the political and economic consequences of his decisions. Joining us now for more in this week's Debrief is Mario Parker. It's great to have you, Mario. How are Republicans playing this right now? Most are home for recess, knowing that some actually voted for a war powers resolution just a couple of weeks ago. How do you balance this matter without insulting the president?
Fits and starts, Joe. It's that's what we're seeing play out within the Republican Party right now. They thought, even as they rebuked the president a couple of weeks back with the war powers vote, they thought this thing was largely behind them. The president pivoted immediately, if you recall. I know 2 weeks is a long time, but if you recall, he went up to Pennsylvania, had a big speech on the economy at a Mack truck facility as well. The thought was that the White House was going into full midterms mode. Again, fits and starts after a few of those instances earlier this year. Now Republicans have to deal with this issue. It continues to come up. As you mentioned, gasoline prices aren't where they were, but they're not cheap either. And that continues to be something that hangs over the midterm elections. Yeah,
we're still in that 380 a gallon zone here, and Congress will be back to business next week. Does this gum things up? Will there be another attempt at a war powers vote?
Well, that's unclear right now whether or not there'll be another attempt. But I've actually, as you know, Joe, there's a few requests that are going on as well in terms of to restock the munitions,
pay for this thing,
all of those things, right? But when you speak to some of the Republican strategists who are watching this, those who are close to many of these elections, they'll tell you the lion's share of the party is still with the president. The problem is with this war, right? You got that vocal contingent. You had Joe Rogan today saying that the president he used an expletive with Iran. But if 2 or 3 percentage points in a swing district, even if it's not necessarily Republicans switching over to vote for Democrats, just staying home when you have an energized Democratic Party is a threat for November.
Well, you remember the 4 senators, and the president was pretty upset about it. Bill Cassidy, who's got an axe to grind, of course, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Rand Paul backed the war powers measure in the Senate. If that came back to the floor, and I know they went back again with a different vote and a different attendance, what would happen if it came back to the floor now, as it appears that fighting is resuming?
It's unclear. We know that the Democrats, for example, are using this to the talking point that's emerged from them over the last 24 hours or so. I'm thinking of Meeks, I'm thinking of Jeffries, et cetera. They're intentionally using illegal war, right? They're intentionally saying, Schumer as well, that this is an illegal war, that they're going to speak with their Senate colleagues in terms of the best steps forward in order to try to constrain or restrain the president's powers there.
You mentioned quickly paying for this war. There's a supplemental budget request that's going to have to be debated. It's a big chunk of money, and some other things have been added to it, including, I believe, even renovating Penn Station. Does that see the light of day, or are Democrats going to slow walk this as well?
Well, you think Democrats are going to slow walk it, but if you recall, when the Republicans were leaving the room last week, they were saying that things got heated, and they were quite vocal about it as well, saying that they wanted more visibility into what that money was going to be used for.
Yeah, really something. It's far from over, Mario. Thank you. That's the debrief for this week with Mario Parker. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and glad you're with us. We're going to stick with oil markets here, taking a bit of a breather. After 2 straight days of U.S. strikes against Iran, with crude edging lower today, in fact, traders took some comfort, it seems, in what they hope will be the limited scope of strikes and Washington's decision to avoid Iranian energy infrastructure. But traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains severely restricted, leaving big questions still about energy flows, supply risk, how long this calm can last. And joining us now to help us with some of these questions is Mike Sommers, the president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. Great to have you by, Mike. Thanks for coming to see us here in our Washington bureau. What are players in the industry saying? What are executives saying? We've seen a rolling sort of shooting ceasefire for weeks now. They may not see yesterday as anything different, do they?
Well, at the same time that you're seeing this rolling shooting going on in the Strait of Hormuz, we do have gasoline prices down about 80 cents a gallon from where we were at the peak in May. So there is some impact here on gasoline prices as a consequence of some reopening of the Strait. We estimate that about 40 to 50% of the flows that were going through the Strait prior to this conflict are making it through right now, but it's not enough. We have to get the Strait open completely if you're going to see a restoration of where oil prices were prior to the conflict.
Well, and despite the fact that the industry and other nations are trying to route oil around the Strait, this remains a critical artery. You made that point at the outset of the war. It's got to be open. It appears to be largely closed now. Are you hearing anything different?
No, but at the same time, you're starting to see other infrastructure being built. You see it in UAE, you see it in Saudi Arabia. Pipelines in particular that are going to be built to go around the Strait. But that's not an immediate answer. Another key that has been occurring right now is that China has really restricted the number of imports that they've been taking from the rest of the world. There was a lot more floating storage than we certainly anticipated at the beginning of this conflict. But China has cut imports by almost 5 million barrels a day. They're starting to get back into these markets, which is why it's so very important we get the Strait completely back open.
The president says he might put the blockade back into effect, but only for Iranian ships. What would that mean for the global price of oil if everybody else was getting through?
Well, one of the reasons why you've started to see a dip in the price is the consequence of those announcements that Iran was going to be back into the oil market. So you were going to start to see a lot more Iranian flows that we really haven't seen since the sanctions were in place over 10 years ago. So there was anticipation that there was going to be more oil coming on the market. You also had anticipation of UAE increasing their production as they were leaving OPEC. So you did see some decline in the futures market as a consequence of some of those announcements. But when the shooting starts again, of course, you're going to see a price response. The most important thing we can do in the immediate term to get prices back down again is to open the Strait up again.
We've never come back even close to $120, the high that we saw in the outset here. Are you surprised by the resiliency of this industry? I mean, there was some real doom and gloom, $150, $200 a barrel. The president talks about this, too, that the administration apparently was bracing for higher prices. Gasoline's still below $4 despite a refining bottleneck. What do you chalk this up to?
You know, one of the most important things you can chalk it up to is the fact that the United States has increased production significantly over the last 5 years. You think about the fact that in 2005, we were producing only 5 million barrels a day, and now we're producing close to 14 million barrels of oil a day. That is the resilience of this industry. We're also seeing that China story is very, very important. They stopped importing oil significantly during this crisis. That left a lot of oil in the marketplace for other countries to use. In addition to that, I think no one anticipated all the floating storage that was on the market. And that's a significant story.
We didn't realize how much oil was on the water.
These markets are incredibly opaque, particularly in Southeast Asia. We estimate also that China has about 1 billion barrels of reserves themselves. So I think what you're going to start to see as the Strait reopens, a lot of countries are going to start refilling their strategic petroleum reserves, like the United States, where we have record low numbers within our SPR, and you're going to start to see these markets recover.
When we talk about the refining bottleneck, this is a very real issue, particularly when Russia is doing less refining. If you're a Valero, if you're a company in the business, what can you do now to help increase capacity?
Well, one of the big heroes in this whole story is the American refining community, the Marathon Petroleums, the Phillips 66, the Valeros, who have increased capacity. They're running at about 96% right now, which is record highs. They're going to need to go down for maintenance at some point, but they're doing everything they can to refine at the highest levels for both jet fuel, gasoline, and diesel. So at some point, they're going to have to go down for maintenance, of course. But right now, during this time of crisis, they're doing everything they can do to supply the American market.
Pretty amazing. You mentioned pipeline and efforts to get around the Strait. Is the administration assisting in efforts or to the extent that they can work with companies to try to hasten that production?
You know, that's one of the proposals that API has put forward in our energy security framework is we should be helping our allies, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, build out that pipeline capacity so we don't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz for future conflicts. We can't depend on the Iranians to maintain the Strait in a free and open way. We need more pipeline capacity in the Middle East to get that product from where it is to where it needs to be in a timely manner.
I think I asked you this last time you were here. It was a day-long conversation about suspending the federal gas tax at the beginning, and President Trump first floated this idea. Lawmakers were apparently all on board. How has this fallen off the front page? Is it something the API, the industry, wants to see?
Well, one of the biggest factors I think that we are not focused on is the renewable fuels mandate that occurs within our gasoline system. Okay. Because of these mandates, you're seeing significantly higher gasoline prices that otherwise would not be there. So if we could do something about the RFS in this country, you would see significantly lower gasoline prices. That is something that the Trump administration and the EPA could do without an act of Congress. They just need to change this program. And if they changed it now, you would see significant price decreases as well.
Interesting. In the meantime, federal gas tax has been framed by many as a drop in the bucket. Is that the view of the industry, that you're just nibbling around the edges?
Look, I mean, it's about 18 cents at the federal level. There's significant gasoline prices, particularly in California, at the state level as well that needs to be considered. But the truth of the matter is there's almost a détente in Congress right now. We don't cut the gasoline tax, and we don't raise the gasoline tax. We haven't touched it in over 30 years. But there is a real reticence in the United States Congress of cutting a gas tax that funds federal highway programs.
Yeah, okay. There was a reporting about the president's meeting with big oil executives in which they talked about a lot of challenges. This was not one of them. The war in Iran reportedly did not come up because there's a trust there with the president that if this gets out of hand, he will take action to address the market. Do you see it that way? Does that trust exist between the administration and the industry?
Look, this administration really has done everything they could do to advance American production. Not just production on federal lands and in federal waters, but they've also focused on the regulatory environment as well. So we have seen a tremendous amount of trust. They've done a tremendous amount of work to make sure that American consumers are paying the lowest amount they can pay at the pump while focusing on regulatory reform at the federal level. At the same time, we know that as long as we have a conflict in the Strait of Hormuz going on, there is going to be elevated prices in this country.
Yeah, well, let's stay in touch as this continues here. Mike, it's good to see you. Mike Sommers with the API, the American Petroleum Institute, live in Washington. Coming up, Graham Platner's exit from the Senate race has opened last-minute scramble among Maine Democrats over who should take on Susan Collins in November. We'll talk it out and what it means for the race and for the party when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us with breaking news from the Wall Street Journal, reporting moments ago that Israel told the U.S. that Iran hatched a new plot to kill President Trump. The Journal, just now citing people familiar with the matter, says Israel shared new intelligence with the U.S., Iran for years vowing openly, of course, to retaliate against Trump for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was a top general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Israeli embassy here in Washington declined to comment. Iran's mission to the UN did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The White House referring the Wall Street Journal to comments the president made on Wednesday when he said at the NATO summit in Turkey that he was at the top of Iran's kill list. Separately today, in a video shared on social media, Graham Platner announcing that he is out, suspending his Senate campaign after a sexual assault allegation surfaced just about a week ago, an allegation Platner denies, but has an 11-minute video that went beyond his own candidacy. Listen.
We live in a political system that is not built for normal people. It is a system that is built structurally to make sure that movements like ours cannot flourish. That if they begin to succeed, they can be crushed. But now the ball is in the court of the Democratic establishment. My name might be on the ballot right now, but that ballot line belongs to the people of Maine.
Platner was casting the selection of the next candidate as a test for Maine's Democratic establishment, arguing the process must be transparent and accountable to voters, not party insiders. Let's play this to the panel. John McCarthy is with us, former senior advisor to President Biden, now principal at Causeway Strategies, our Democratic strategist alongside Republican strategist Lisa Camuso Miller, founder of the Friday Reporter Public Affairs and senior advisor at Rock Solutions. Great panel this evening and wonderful to have both of you with us. John, welcome to the table. As our Democrat, I would love your thoughts on this because Graham Platner said a lot of things. He was emotional, seeming angry. In an 11-minute freestyle video recorded on his phone, never apologized. Is he actually out of this race?
I mean, that is the hope. I mean, as far as unless anything's broken in the last few minutes, he still hasn't filed the paperwork to formally do so, but has made the case. I will say that the Democratic Party should have moved on from him a while ago. I don't think that he represents the best of our party, and I tend to be of the mindset that where the Republican Party has went recently is dangerous. I think the Democrats really need to stand on our ground and say we're the good guys and that we're going to tolerate none of this.
What's he doing waiting till Monday, though, just to give you a little more
I think part of the problem is it's funny. His video where he sat and said, you know, that politics is not made for normal people. I mean, he's kind of the caricature of a normal person, but I mean, he's kind of been made up by a bunch of the far left consultants inside of my party.
Wow.
So I don't actually think that he's really representative of what he's saying. I think he's a first-time candidate in this way. He's probably getting some conflicting advice from people who are around him. There's an insurgent left, obviously, happening inside the Democratic Party at this moment. And I think that those folks are really trying to hold on to power as long as they can. So maybe some other folks are trying to maneuver, but I will say this has moved on from him. I will say that the state party in Maine is really excellent at this moment. The executive director and the chairman have been very clear that they're going to try and do a really inclusive process. They're going to have what they've said, conventions out at the county level. They're then going to call people in for a state convention. And there's conversation now about how can you kind of do write-ins or solicitations from everyday voters, too. I think that's a really broad and transparent process, and that's a good thing. That's how a democracy is supposed to work. So I think that that's trending in the right direction. Hopefully this very long 11-minute video is the last that we hear from him.
We'll see about that. Lisa, is this good news for Susan Collins, or would it have been a lot easier for her to beat the oysterman with the scandal?
Well, you always find it easier to fight against the one that you know, the enemy that you know. And so, but this also is a very short runway for whoever does step in. Senator Collins has an extraordinary background, an extraordinary long history of doing the right thing for the state of Maine. And this has only provided more of an opportunity for her to remind the voters of that. So anyone that steps in at this point, Joe, would have to be either someone with a long record of remarkable work, which would be hard to top, Senator Collins, but also, too, the mess that has been made in Maine is just, I don't think it's clean. I don't think they can clean it up.
Many, though, thought that he would be easily toppled by Susan Collins.
For sure.
If you get, you know, a candidate who was vetted, for instance, in the gubernatorial primary, who might have state name recognition, is there a chance? Are you writing off Maine for Democrats? This is not a conversation.
I think Susan Collins would win that seat handily.
Well, all right. And so, John, talk to me about that, because if you believe the conventional wisdom, Democrats have to win Maine to take the Senate.
And there's some truth to that. You know, I do think that in this political environment, there are good wins in Democrat sales. So weird things could happen and interesting candidates could come online. I think probably by the end of July, we'll have a pretty clear picture of where the House is going. I think maybe later in the fall, we'll see where the Senate is going, probably September. But I do think that in conventional wisdom would suggest that this is the only state that Kamala Harris won out of the ones that are viable for Democrats to pick up. So if we take Maine out of the equation, Democrats need to be competitive in states that Donald Trump won in by double digits. That's going to be really tricky. So I think it's very important that this process and how it plays out in terms of replacing this person on the ballot makes people feel enfranchised, makes people feel a part of it, because it's the only way. I agree with you. I think Susan Collins is a really tough candidate to beat. So we need to find someone who is sensible and can get over the finish line.
Well, it's going to be expensive. Whomever is chosen won't be Graham Platner, won't be the oyster fisherman with the story and the tattoo. I guess that's a good thing for Democrats, but for Republicans, they have an opportunity to define immediately who that next candidate is. We've got 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, to throw this convention together. This could draw a lot of money from both sides.
It certainly can. I mean, this is going to be an expensive year regardless, Joe. I mean, if you think about Maine is one example. There are plenty of others where money is going to really be drawn away. Texas is another example where Republicans and Democrats are going to spend a lot of money. It's going to be an interesting season, and I think it's going to be, I would like to probably make a prediction that it's going to be probably the most expensive election we've seen in a midterm in our
My God, history. This one alone with Texas, the Paxton Talarico race. Numbers jump off the page there. Paxton raises $9 million. The confetti pops. Then Talarico shows up with $30 million.
You could see that race topping $100 million probably by the end of this cycle.
Well, how's James Talarico, the purported vegan in Texas, pulling that kind of cash?
Well, I mean, I do think that this is something that the Democratic Party needs to be wary of. We tend to fall in love with someone who gave a good speech once or that we found online after having said something clever. Exactly. And this cycle has really demonstrated that that's not a good way to pick your candidates, especially when the stakes are this high. There is certainly a tension inside of the party, and I think that there's a lot of media attention paid to the far left kind of insurgents. But they certainly don't represent the vast majority of the places where we need to win. Overwhelmingly, the seats that we need to pick up in order to take back the majority are going to come from moderate places. These will be mostly districts that performed for Donald Trump maybe between 3 to 5 points. That's really the sweet spot for Democrats. And the kind of internet celebrity talking about social issues, not a winning message for Democrats. We need to hone in on being able to talk about the economy and cost of living.
Is Talarico not doing that?
Talarico's a very interesting candidate for Texas, I think. I think that his background, obviously, as a seminarian, he's young, he's charismatic, he's aspirational. I think that he could certainly work there. Texas is just admittedly a hard state. In many ways, it's Lucy the football. If there's someone who can, pick it off,
you're being real careful
here. It's probably Talarico. But the other thing is, I think that there are other states, like places like Iowa, where we have just an incredible candidate there. Someone like that, I could see coming online. Alaska, we have an amazing recruit with Congresswoman Peltola.
You need all of these to win this.
You need a combination of them. And I think that there's a lot of attention being paid to certain states that we're calling must-wins. But the reality is the quality of candidates matter. Maine could have been a great state for us if we had a great candidate in there. Hopefully we'll get there. But unless we're able to put someone in who's really viable in these places, the math doesn't matter.
Well, let's keep talking candidate quality. What was Ken Paxton doing in London on the 4th of July?
Oh, I don't know. He didn't call me, but I will say that it seems to me like regardless of what I think John makes a very good point, it is going to be irresistible for people to want to support a candidate like Talarico in Texas. He will still not win.
He will still not win.
Still not win.
With that kind of financial advantage.
Texas. Lucy and the football is probably the most apt comparison.
So call Beto and ask why.
To say, difficult, very difficult. And Texas, I also think, too, that the idea of all of that is the one that will distract from other viable candidates, as John recommends, because I think he's absolutely right. We will be distracted by the bright and shiny object. By we, I mean political parties, Republicans and Democrats. But the game is won in the districts. It's won in the numbers, and it's won where people are hearing a resounding message. And economy and jobs still number one on the minds of the voters.
I will say, though, Talarico is the great candidate, and Ken Paxton's a great candidate to run against. So, in that case scenario, both of those things work out pretty well.
There's a chance.
There is.
Hey, did you guys see on the way over here, there's more construction going on at the White House? They wrapped the north portico with some sort of tarp, and there's a picture on it to make it look like nothing's happening. Is he putting new Corinthian columns in front of the White House? What do you hear?
Well, famously, Donald Trump is such a minimalist, and he has such great taste. So I see that this will probably just be really tasteful.
Look, do you see how they did this, Lisa? This is pretty good. I want to do this to my house next time I get a job.
I worked there for all 4 years of the Biden administration.
Sure did.
I know, you served there as well. It's a great place and an honor to work there. I actually think that this creates a political problem for the president because it just shows that something that belongs to the people, he thinks he gets to do anything with. I think that's really been the story of his time in the White House and what he's done with the ballroom, what he's done to the Oval Office, which is ghastly. It just kind of feeds into this narrative as we head towards the midterms that he's focused on things that are self-aggrandizing for him, not himself, not the voters.
I've heard some talk about that. I think we still will hear more. John McCarthy, come back and see us. Lisa Camuso-Miller, great to have you back as always. A great panel. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. I'll check on those columns on my way home. This is Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.